Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. Thanks for tuning in. We've got a good one today about how to fish lily pads and what the best baits are. You know, it's summertime and this is the time when lily pads really start to shine. When they are at their full size, they create the most shade and the fish utilize them to get out of the summer heat and that sun. It's a great place for shade and the fish really like to get into them. You know, there's all kinds of different types of lily pads. You got ones, the lotus pads that are giant. You've got the little silver dollar pads. But pretty much around the entire country, you're going to find lily pads of some form. And I have yet to find any that the fish don't utilize. Now, I'm not going to say it's as simple as go to the pads and find the fish, because it's not that easy. But I will pretty much guarantee you that on lakes that do have lily pads, that you're going to be able to find fish utilizing them in some form or fashion. There's a couple ways that I target them. The first is I try to usually find some sort of deeper water that runs through the pads. So if you've got a ditch or an old creek channel, usually that's a really good starting place to find where the fish are at. You know, the pads may grow from a couple feet of water down to say 4 feet of water, but you want to treat them pretty much like a weed line or you know, if you're fishing weeds, you want to start with a weed line. You know, other areas that can be good are, you know, your scattered pad areas. It's the same as kind of having scattered weeds. The fish can roam around in them a little bit better. Or if you can just find deeper areas within a shallow pad flat, you may not be able to visually see that because the pads will look the same across. But if you can find maybe a depression in the bottom, you know, if there's additional cover mixed in, so a lot of times you get pads that form right on the edge of a weed line. So if you go from hydrilla to pads or milfoil to pads, that transition is a really good place to start. So what I'm getting at is you want to find something that's a little bit different amongst that pad field. You know, pads can really be overwhelming because you can go into them and you could have acres and acres and acres of pads. So the first thing you want to do is try to break down that pad field. Where are the pad edges? Where's the deeper water? Are there additional pieces of structure within it? Sometimes you have pads that go up to a lay down tree, or you could have pads that go up to docks. It really doesn't matter, but you're looking for some sort of transition point. Those are really good places that hold fish. You don't just want to go into a pad field and fan cast. You know, it can work at times, but usually there's really specific areas they're holding. Sometimes you'll find that there's a transition of pads in themselves. You know, a lot of lakes that I fish have silver dollar pads that meet bigger pads, and those transitions can be really good. Or it's just maybe an area that has really thick pads versus sparser pads. Sometimes if you have a really thick patch, that'll provide the most shade in that pad field. Sometimes they want to be in that sparser stuff. So if you have a really thick pad field and there's a little area of sparser pads, that could be better. But the key is that's different from the, you know, the entire pad field as a whole. So you want to just be aware of it. A lot of it is simply visual. It's not necessarily easy to use your electronics or like forward facing electronics in pad fields because it just becomes really cluttered. The other key with pads is you want to find pad fields that have bait in them, and a lot of times the bait is simply bluegills or panfish, and it's pretty easy a lot of times to figure out where the panfish are because you can hear them sucking on the bottom of the pad. They're literally grabbing bugs off the pad, so you'll hear like a popping sound. And if you have an active pad field with panfish, usually you have an active pad field with game fish like bass at the same time. So that's really a big key. If you go into a pad field and you're not seeing bait or panfish, you're not hearing sounds, you're not hearing life, then it's probably not going to go down real well for you. But if you can find one that's active or find some transition amongst the pad field, those are your starting places, and those are really good areas to fish. I do want to point out one thing I like about, or one thing I would really recommend when fishing pad fields is to go with a braided line. The braid will cut through the pad stems really well, so when you do get a fish on, you can get them out a lot easier than you can with other lines. That's one of the biggest issues with fishing pads is when you get a bass on, they're going to get you down inside the pads and around stocks. Like it's now no question, it's going to happen. As much as you want to try to horse them in and keep them up above the pads, you're going to have fish that always get you wrapped around pad stocks. And the braided line will help cut through those pads to get the fish back to you. It also allows you to get really better, much better hook sets as well, because a lot of times when the fish bites your bait, they instantly are around a pad stock. And when you try to set with, say, a fluorocarbon or a monofilament, you set the hook, you're just going to run into issue where that bait is that line is at a 90-degree angle, and when you set the hook, there's a lot of slack there. You're just not going to drive the hook home nearly as well as you will with braid. So I do recommend, regardless of watercolor, fishing braided line if you're fishing lily pads. In terms of bait choices, guys, these are kind of my staples anytime I'm fishing pads. The first is obvious, guys, a frog, right? A frog is a phenomenal bait around pads for a couple of reasons. One, extremely weedless. Two, it mimics the frogs that a lot of times are living in the marshy areas that the pads are in. And three, it generates a lot of bites, and it's a really easy bait to work through the pads, right? Because it's on the surface. That's one of the hardest things to do when fishing pad fields is working your bait through the stalks. So a topwater bait like this, really, really good. Now to go along with that, another bait, if you have some sparser pads or larger pads that are clean of other vegetation, is a buzzbait. A buzzbait's similar to a frog, but you need it to be a little bit sparser. A frog is really weedless, and you can throw it into the thickest pads out there and find just the little holes and work it in those holes. A buzzbait, you need it to be a little sparser. It's a really good bait too to work along pad edges. In this case, this is just a Dirty Jigs buzzbait with a Berkley pit boss on the end. Again, a similar bait to this is throwing some sort of toad style bait, your whatever your favorite toad bait is that you might put on the back of a buzzbait is the same, toad style bait that you can throw and just cast over the pads. Again, that's really similar to a frog and kind of a hybrid between these two. So I'm not going to just pull that out and give you a separate one, but it's definitely a bait choice to use as well. The next is a swimming style worm. This is a Berkley wind-up worm. Your Zoom speed worm works great. You wanna rig it on a lighter Texas style rig, so it's going to be weedless, and you have a bullet weight that gives it the ability to kind of just swim through the pads. I will peg it if it's really thick. If they're sparser pads, I'll leave it unpegged. But you just need to be patient. You cast it out and just wind it back slowly, and the line will kind of find its way around the pad stems, and the bait will just kind of swim through the pad stems really well. A nice slow, steady retrieve is perfect. They will crush that. That's a really good choice when they're not willing to come up on top and hit your frogs. Similar to a swimming worm is a swim jig. It's a Dirty Jig swim jig with the Berkley deal. A swim jig is a phenomenal bait for fishing around pad stems. You can swim it just like the Texas rigged the swimming worm. You can swim it right through the pad stems. You just got to be patient with it. You don't want to throw it out and just jerk it into a pad stem, because some of the pad stems are thick enough, have thick enough stalks where you're going to then drive the hook home into the stalk and you'll get stuck. But if you just take a nice, slow, steady retrieve, you're going to swim that bait right through the pad stems, and it works really, really well. A bluegill colored swim jig can be great. A shad colored swim jig like this one can be really good if the shad are in there spawning, because a lot of times they'll use pad fields to spawn too, so that's something you want to remember. The last choice I have is a stick worm. This is a Berkley Max Scent General. Stick worms are great. You rig them Texas style and you pitch them into holes in the pads. That is one of my favorite ways to fish pads, especially when the bass are spawning. Pad fields are really good spawning fields because the bass will spawn on the roots of the pad fields. And if you see a hole in the pads, a lot of times that's a bed that the fish has created and has kept the pads away, so you have an open spot above them. Really good way to fish it. Down in Florida, your favorite stick worm on pad stalks and little pad clumps is a great way to catch big fish. So you definitely want to have some sort of stick worm like this General rigged up for fishing pad fields. But that's it, guys. If you got a lake with pads around it, don't be overwhelmed by the pads. Get out there, try to break it down into sections, into areas where there's transitions, and you're going to catch more fish. It's a really fun way to fish. You know, if you got a good frog bite going, it's just a super exciting way to fish. And there are some really big fish that live in those areas. So give your pad fields a try. I hope this was helpful, guys. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share it on your social media pages. A lot of these baits are available at thereelshot.com. The description, the link is in the description. Click on it. Use the discount code Stefan10. You'll save 10% off your order. It helps the channel out. I appreciate you watching.